Explanatory letter written by Michael Morley. Mr. Morley was the donator of this box and former manager of the Morton Heritage Centre. He was 14 in 1974 but composed this letter many years later. Town records confirm that his sister, Dawn Morley, disappeared in early 1974. They told me it was the wind, but even then, I didn't believe them. They told me, through sobs and quick exchange of glances, that it was the water that took my Dawn. They said it was the water, and even then, I didn't believe them. Even at 14 years old, I had already decided that I could trust my own instincts, and what I learned from books far more than I could trust the grown-ups. Though some books are fiction, and so it's basically their job to lie, you can often find more truth even in those stories than will be shared with by the adults. The thing about books is, they don't know how old you are, what your background is, or how you're going to approach their content. They don't worry that you might be too young, too sensitive, or too frightened to handle the information. A book does not judge its audience. Instead, it lays it all out there, the full and brutal details for all to see, regardless of who you are, as long as you're smart enough to pick the right books and keep them out of sight of the grown-ups. It was a very famous book, one that my parents knew well, that told me the truth about the water, the wind, and werewolves. Dracula, an old Gothic classic that my parents expected me not to read because it would probably bore me, sat on the shelves in my father's office for years. He hadn't touched it since he was in his 20s, and even then probably hadn't finished it. He knew that he owned a copy and that it was somewhere on his shelves, but he hadn't touched that volume or even thought about it for years, and since he didn't think much about it, he didn't notice when it was gone. In the book, I read about the wolves of Transylvania, how they jumped and snarled at the carriage travelling through the Carpathian Mountains. I learned that they hunted in packs with their lolling tongues and sharp white teeth waiting to rip their victims to pieces. I learned also that over the jagged peaks of those mountains, above the lines of conifers and firs, in the dark shadowed forests where predators still roamed, the wolves would call out to each other and to the moon in long and baleful howls. "Listen to them, the children of the night," says Dracula, as a creature of the night himself. "What music they make." I remember reading that line and wondering how anyone could describe those starving, ravenous howls, full of menace and savagery, as music. That line stayed with me, as did the vision of the great black dog running from the wreck of the Demeter, disappearing into the night as that cursed ship's only survivor. Intrigued and excited by the novel itself and the creatures it contained, I searched out more books, both in my father's office and at the local library where old Mrs. Lambert, knowing what a keen student I was, would turn a blind eye to some of my more mature selections. I read all there was to read about vampires, the supernatural, the occult, and more than anything, werewolves. I read the fictional accounts, famous stories by famous authors, and those lesser-known tales that contribute to the lore. Noticing the differences from one book to the next, I went in search of some definitive answers and wandered away from fiction into history, anthropology, biology, and zoology, learning all I could not only about werewolf legends but about real wolves themselves and their many fascinating behaviors. I sought out TV shows and documentaries on the topic and heard on screen those same chilling sounds that I heard in my own head when reading Dracula, the sound of a wolf hungrily howling. So, when it was my turn to hear those howls for real, in real life and in my part of the world, I knew what I was hearing no matter what my folks might say. The hideous keening wail rising over the mountains near my home, tearing into the night like some awful siren, was exactly what I heard before and exactly what I'd imagined. I knew without having to ask that the sound had come from a wolf, and despite what the count in my novel might say, it was not in any way musical. My folks said it was the wind, that the howls I heard were just the sound of air ripping past the masonry or catching in the eaves, but that was not wind. That sound, I knew from the things I'd read, was a beast, the same beast that I suspected, that I knew had taken my sister. Dawn disappeared a day before I heard the howls. She had been walking down by Carswell Woods on the way home from her friend Jenny's house. Usually when the sun began to sink and the streetlights turned on, she knew it was time to head home. With the blackouts, it was less clear, so she had said goodbye to her friend and started out on the short walk through the wooded pathway near the river that divided the different areas of the village a little later than usual. She never made it home. I remember in a vague way, without ever looking at the clock, that I knew Dawn was late. The sky at that point in the winter turned dark fairly quickly, but there was usually a period of around a half hour to 40 minutes during which the purples and reds in that frigid sky lingered a little before turning to a deep and icy blue and fading eventually to black. By the time my mother began to ask my father if Dawn was home yet, the sky had already begun to turn navy. Far later, I knew that Dawn would ever choose to be. It was almost dark, which meant Dawn was late, and if Dawn was late, that meant there was something wrong. The police arrived around 3 hours later. My mother has given Dawn the benefit of the doubt, imagining that she had lost track of time because the street lights, her usual reminder to head back, were off. She expected that her daughter would come tumbling through the door with a mouthful of excuses and would be grounded from that moment, probably until she turned 16 in another 4 years' time. I remember seeing my mother pacing back and forth at the bottom of the stairs, muttering and swearing as much to herself as to my father or anyone listening that she was going to give Dawn hell when she finally walked through that door. My mother had never raised her hand to us at any point in our childhood, but as she turned circuits on the carpet, wringing her hands together, she swore over and over that when that little madam gets home, I swear to God I'm going to tan her ass so that she can't sit down for a week. I think the anger, or at least the display of it, was a way of distracting herself from the very real terror she was feeling. Deep down, she, my father and I all knew that if and when Dawn did walk through the door, she would scoop her up in her arms and kiss her all over, so overcome with relief that would forget all of her previous threats. Though of course, Dawn never did come through the door. The handle upon which my mother kept her eyes firmly fixed never moved an inch. After a few hours and a series of frantic phone calls to Jenny's parents, the Maddens, confirming that yes, Dawn had left and no, they had not seen her since, my mother gave in to my father's wishes and finally called the police as he put on his coat and headed out to look for her. With Dawn being a minor and a younger child to boot, the police arrived quite quickly, and my father was actually still out looking when they got there. They explained that they would begin a search, that they would use dogs, and that if my mother had a recent photograph and a piece of Dawn's clothes that would be helpful. I remember my mother took a photo from a nearby frame of me and my sister. Oddly, instead of simply handing it to the officer and pointing out which of her 2 children was Dawn, she instead tore the photograph in 2 and gave him the half with Dawn's picture, keeping the other half for herself as if scared to let go of it. The police set off with a promise to let her know if they found anything just as my father came back through the door. They did not come back with anything until the following day. That night I lay in bed, scared and worried about what might have happened to my sister. It was on that night, the night after Dawn vanished, that I first heard the howl. I remember the sound made not only me, but my parents freeze into silence. We had been sitting in the living room, my father with his arm draped across my mother's shoulders, me silent in the armchair across from them with no idea what to do or say to make things better. When it came, long, deep and guttural, the sound seemed to tear through the silence like a knife. I remember my mother sat bolt upright, listening as the sound came again in a second longer howl, deeper and more visceral, as if whatever creature had made it had pulled the sound not from its throat but from the wet maze of its bowels, wrenching the sound upward to ring and echo and terrify. My parents sat silent as if someone had pressed pause on the entire world, and no one was allowed to move a muscle. I often wonder how long they would have stayed like that had there not been a knock at the door. As my mother moved to answer the call, I was ordered up to my room. My mother opened the door to let in the police. I remember seeing how they bundled quickly inside and noticing how, unlike last time, there was a real urgency in the way they entered. The 2 officers, one male and one female, positively bolted inside and were very quick to close the door behind them, both of them looking back into the darkness they had just stepped out of as if suspicious that it might follow them in. They're scared, I thought. Something out there has scared them, the same awful sound that had terrified my parents. They had come back without Dawn, but heavy with suspicions. My father kissed my forehead without ever taking his eyes off the officers and ushered me toward the stairs, telling me it was time for bed and for me to go upstairs like a good boy and tuck myself in. On my way up the stairs, I asked loudly enough for the police officers to be able to hear me what had made those awful ringing howls. What kind of animal or creature could produce such a noise? I remember the male police officer glared at this colleague before jumping in with the response that it was just the wind ringing through the tops of the houses, that it was nothing to worry about, and that I should get off to bed. The same awful howls rang through the village for 3 nights after that. During those 3 nights, I asked 2 questions. What was making those noises, and what had happened to Dawn? I was told that sound was the wind in the eaves, and as for Dawn, as far the police and my parents could tell, she had fallen into the river and drowned, the current sweeping her quickly away so that her body up to that point could not be retrieved or found. The water, they said, was strong at that point, and the current, it seemed, had taken her. They said it was the wind, they told me it was the water, but even then I knew better. I knew it was the wolf.